There you go. And welcome to our speakers. Go ahead.
Thank you, Krista. Good afternoon and welcome to our panel, Opening Access in Remote Communities, a Canadian North Perspective. Tammy, Jim, and I are humbled that you've chosen to attend our session today and to be speaking this week among inspirational educators from around the world. They have lovely open education backgrounds on their screens. Unfortunately, mine made me look a bit like an alien, so I've turned it off. So you just see me. I'd like to first acknowledge that Tammy and I join you from Yellowknife, located on Chief Dry Geese territory, traditional home of the Yellowknives Dene. These are also the traditional lands of the North Slave Métis. Jim joins us from Wati, a community on the self-governed territory of the Cleacho people. We extend our respect and appreciation to the Yellowknives Dene, North Slave Métis, and Cleacho people for sharing their land with us. I have the honor and the privilege to introduce my colleagues joining me on the panel. Jim Stauffer has been a community adult educator in a remote northern community for the past 12 years and has recently transitioned to the role of adult learning specialist, educational technology. He has a Master's of Arts in Learning and Technology from Royal Roads University. Tammy Sowens-White has been an instructor in the School of Business and Leadership for 23 years and is currently working on her PhD in student success for remote post-secondary education. And I am Wanda Roberts. I've been a nurse for 26 years. I have been teaching the personal support worker program for the past 12, and I'm currently completing a graduate degree in distance education. So I would like to ask Tammy to unmute. She is going to provide you with an overview of where we are situated in the world. And after Tammy speaks, Jim will provide a preliminary statement about our use of the words open education. Tammy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Wanda. I'd like to begin by situating ourselves on our map of Canada here. We're located in the Northwest Territories, which is the West Central Canadian Territory, which spans both the Arctic and the subarctic regions. Our geographical area spans 1.34 million square kilometers, and we have a population of 41,000 people that inhabit 33 communities and 1 reservation. Aurora College, the college that we all work at, our infrastructure spans this large geographical space with 3 campuses and 19 satellite community learning centers.
So I was hoping to give a bit of a global context by showing you our Northwest Territory landmass in comparison to Europe. How our 3 main campuses, Inuvik, Yellowknife, and Fort Smith in the south, cover roughly the distance between London and Rome. And then I realized, Jim, you're doing it again. And so once we decenter whiteness in our comparisons, I guess our landmass isn't all that impressive. So with regard to the use of open, when we submitted our proposal to this panel, to the Open Ed conference, I was afraid we might be stretching the defined boundaries of open education. But I still felt we had something significant to contribute in terms of the way Aurora College is opening access to education in our remote northern communities. And then I read Bali, Cronin, and Gingani's 2020 paper, Framing Open Educational Practices from a Social Justice Perspective. And I realized that our ideas about open education fit well within the parameters after all. So I'm putting a link to our the open version of these slides in the chat. And we'd invite you to join in there, leave some notes for us. And if it fills up, you can just keep typing, or you can put more in the speaker's notes. And if we don't have time for all the questions at the end, this will provide a valuable feedback for us and for you as well, as we continue to develop open education at Aurora College. Over to you, Wanda.
Thank you, Jim. So we'll begin, I guess, with our first question for the panel. Can you please describe the learners who enroll in your program? So Tammy, I'll get you to answer this question first, please.
Thanks again, Wanda. So I currently work within the School of Business and Leadership at Aurora College, training students for jobs in business, government, and administration. Historically, 80% of our grads or greater have been women. Many have children and some are single parents. Some of our students are also responsible for additional family members. The age range for our students is between 17 years and 76 years, with most being adult learners. The ethnicity of our students includes both Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners. Our Indigenous learners are Aboriginal learners from various groups within our Northern Territory. Our non-Indigenous students come from many ethnic backgrounds, including Canadian citizens, landed immigrants, and newcomers to Canada. A small portion of our students, less than 10%, are international. Very few of our students come directly out of high school, less than 10% of them actually, and most are late entry learners, many who have had previous experience in post-secondary education before entering our program. Approximately 30% of our students gain access to our program through our bridging program called Developmental Studies or Upgrading. Back to you, Wanda.
Thanks, Tammy. I too will answer the same question. So I teach the personal support worker program, and the cohort we usually have in our program aren't that much different from Tammy's. The personal support worker program is a one-year certificate program that prepares graduates to become frontline healthcare providers, primarily in long-term care, home care, group homes, and hospitals. Typically, students who are drawn to this program are women, ages 20 to 60, approximately half of whom are of Indigenous descent, and the other half are newcomers to Canada. The large majority of these women are mothers, many of them being single parents. Most of our students choose PSW education because they're looking to become independent and to create what they perceive to be a better life for their families and their communities. Many talk about having a desire to make a difference in the world. They see helping and caring for elders as meaningful and important work, which of course I agree with. Students often speak of and demonstrate a tremendous respect for elders. Many have previous care-related experience with family members or were raised by their elders. A resounding theme is a desire to improve quality of life for older adults living in their communities. Jim, I'm going to give you a chance to answer this question too, please.
Sure. I'd like to start off by saying that learners at our community learning centers are adults with a tremendous courage and hope. They're people who have overcome their fears far enough to give another try at education in spite of a system that's not only failed them, but has traumatized them in the past. I think of a former student who survived a cold water drowning as a young child. So in school, he had difficulty remembering what he had learned the day before. His anger at the constant belittling and mistreatment by teachers finally got him expelled in junior high. That this man would come back in his 40s to learn to read and would share his story with me speaks of a resilient hope and ability to trust I can hardly imagine. It turns out this man, who was expelled as a failure, has a knack for teaching his Indigenous language. He assisted in a Clincho language class I facilitated and has a video on YouTube. Not everybody is yet able to tell their stories, but the ongoing colonization is evident in the way that many adults, and even young adults, not only the older residential school survivors, the way they've been conditioned to expect that school will teach them the right answers, which they then have to recall in order to qualify for a job. This makes some of them resistant to the idea of learning from each other. Most have not previously been given permission to draw their own conclusions, much less voice their own ideas or express what they're learning. For one math class, we built bookshelves, and I'll never forget the look on a young mom's face as she peered up through her goggles after cutting a dado with my very noisy, very heavy half-inch router and said triumphantly, "No more afraid." Most learners who come to our learning centers, they're coping with poverty and addictions, they're underemployed or unemployed. They're looking for something to make their resume more attractive in a tight job market for entry-level positions. These are individuals who have been denied the social capital or academic skills they need to leave the community and attend on-campus programs. Virtually 100% of them are members of Indigenous groups, usually born and raised in our small fly-in community. Their ages range sometimes from barely 20 to 50 and up. A 76-year-old elder in our Northern Perspectives course shared her insights and wisdom so generously. At the end of the course, I felt like we should be paying her as a guest lecturer. So I hope this sketch I have portrayed the courage and hope of the learners who come to the community learning centers.
Indeed, I think you have, Jim. Thank you, Tammy and Jim. We're going to move on to question number 2. What are some of the challenges or barriers that you perceive that learners face within your program or context? Tammy?
Thanks, Wanda. Again, I'm going to talk about the School of Business and Leadership. I think that some of our biggest challenges stem from many of our systemic issues. The geographical distance between campuses and communities is a big one. Almost a decade ago, we started to bridge the gap between our 3 campuses by investing in video conferencing equipment to try and bridge the gap between the campuses. And we also further developed a learning management system with it. This system allowed us to manage program cutbacks and limited expertise in our field, and more importantly, to allow us to connect our students between the high Arctic, the Central Arctic, and down to the southern border of the territory. Connecting our students so that everyone had access to programming, and this means that everyone receives fairness in trying to obtain their education. Without this, education is not open and it's not accessible. Other barriers include the challenges some remote students have in accessing high school courses to meet program entrance requirements, language barriers, and an understanding in how to navigate education at a distance. Many of our students also struggle with how to navigate college policies and procedures. An example of this is our attendance policy. Other compounding factors that our students face relate to financial issues, housing issues, childcare issues. We also must consider the trauma in education, as Jim has already spoken about, including personal experiences of trauma, intergenerational trauma, and student violence, all which heavily impact learning and teaching in our institution. Thank you, Wanda.
Thanks, Tammy. I'm going to tackle this question next. Again, I'll speak to the personal support worker students that we see in our program. And again, I teach on the Yellowknife campus. So a bigger center, it's our capital city. There's 18,000 residents. So it's considered a large city. There are a number of challenges that I would like to speak to. Some are very similar to some of the ones that Tammy has mentioned. The first I want to speak to, though, is housing. Student housing for the Yellowknife campus has very few family units, which are highly sought after and generally full well before our program seats are full. Many applicants have had to turn down seats in our program due to a lack of family housing. I often wonder how many more families and communities we could have impacted had those students been given the opportunity to attend school. Students are also often reluctant to leave their communities because they will lose their housing units in their home communities if they leave and go to school. There is significant housing shortage in most communities in the Northwest Territories, which means when students leave home to attend school, they have to vacate their housing units to accommodate others in the community who require housing. When they return to their community after completion of their education, they are put on a wait list for housing and often have to wait months, if not years, to get another home to live in. We had a graduate who returned to her home community to work and had to live in a shed with her 4 children for a full year before they acquired suitable housing. This isn't acceptable. There have also been a number of students who chose to leave school midway through the year because they had to choose between retaining their homes in their communities and receiving an education. In addition, there are graduates who choose to remain in Yellowknife after graduation and not return to their homes or to their home communities. This certainly benefits employers and seniors in Yellowknife, but does not help smaller communities support elders to age in place. An additional challenge is childcare. Students in the PSW program complete practicum hours at local healthcare agencies, meaning that they have to be at the hospital by 7 a.m. 2 mornings a week. This means that students require early morning childcare for their kids before schools and daycares are even open. Many are single parents, far removed from their informal support network while they're in Yellowknife attending school. Further barriers that we see in our program are difficulties achieving the minimum English requirements in order to be accepted into the program, family violence and substance use, which often leads to students leaving school. And PSW program historically has been just face-to-face on campus with little flexibility in delivery, which has made it difficult for adult learners to juggle home and work responsibilities. Jim, I'm going to ask you to please give us a perspective of a community adult educator in a small remote community.
Sure, Wanda. I've already addressed challenges adult learners carry into the Learning Center, including the perception that their learning is dependent on a teacher in classroom. But then our institutional context adds more challenges. We have made attendance the primary criteria that determines whether or not learners receive credit for our literacy and essential skills courses. Now, that seemed like an equitable thing to do, given that the courses build on life experience, they emphasize participation and engagement over academic achievement, and learners bring a wide range of literacies to the courses. But students also face a wide variety of community and personal pressures in their lives that make attendance a challenge. For example, here in Wati, we're a fly-in community with a seasonal road during the 8 to 10 weeks in the coldest winter months. We lost 80% of our participants in the last week of one course because our schedule ran into a major traditional hand games tournament. It was held in our community when the winter road was open. I'm not sure how familiar you are with North American Indigenous hand games, but it's far from a simple guessing game of which hand holds the token. It has theatrics that are immensely entertaining, even for outsiders who may not appreciate the full technical and psychological complexity of hand games. So being a part of this gathering of communities was far more valuable to both the players and spectators among our students than being in the classroom to complete a course. And we were not able or not willing to flex with that rhythm of the community because, well, it impacted our upcoming course schedules. And I chuckle because then COVID showed us just how trivial our scheduling could become. So as we move toward online learning, it becomes apparent that there are communicational technologies and there are pedagogies that make it inexcusable to exclude learners with lower literacy levels from distance education. But our high internet costs, and you're going to hear this over and over again, our high internet costs make access unreachable for unemployed learners without some kind of a subsidy. And we're now finding that subsidies are hampered by mistrust. The fear that students might use their internet for non-educational entertainment keeps cropping up in every solution that we propose. So that's a sampling of the challenges to open education that I see in our context.
Thank you, Jim. So now we've talked about barriers. We'll talk about overcoming. I feel like the more hopeful maybe side of things, how we overcome barriers and how we're working to hopefully open education here in the Northwest Territories. So Tammy, I'm going to ask you to answer the question, how do you help learners overcome these barriers that you speak of?
Thanks, Sawanta. So I believe that there's actually two levels in helping students overcome the barriers. There's the systemic level that we have, and then there's the personal level. So systemically, we have secured internet connections through a dedicated line directly to our 3 campuses, assuring that if a student is at a campus, they will be connected. Recently, we had a power outage in Yellowknife, and I'm actually located like Wanda in our city. So I was invigilating my exams from my classroom inside the campus, and the power outage occurred throughout the entire city of Yellowknife. All of the other faculties and programs in our college were impacted by the outage during our midterm exam week. But our system within the video conferencing system was stable and no disruptions occurred during our exam process because we had committed to a dedicated line. We also have formalized our learning management systems and developed online presence for our courses in an effort to reduce the geographical divide between our campuses. This has cost a lot of money. On a more personal level, I take an intuitive approach to how we overcome barriers, which means that how I address barriers changes every year. The most fundamental and most important activity that I do is to create a relationship with each and every student. I do this by learning about their students, their families, and their lives, who they are, where they come from, and what they're interested in. By building these relationships, I have a more intimate connection with our students, and it becomes easier to help students navigate successfully through the programs. Connection is the key. Pedagogically speaking, there are many things I do to ensure that students progress through our programs. First and foremost, I work to reduce student anxiety in the classroom so students feel safe and welcome. Anxiety can be compounded by the distance between our students at various campuses and the blending format that we use. Reducing anxiety in the classroom depends on the students and their needs. Some of the things that I do include, I set a set schedule and stick to it so students can rely on the predictability of the course process. I scaffold learning to build on basic concepts to more complex information. I also invite our developmental studies students into our classroom to see how our class operates. This allows incoming students to see themselves in our program and to acknowledge that entry is possible. I invite students to set up daily meetings and to connect in a variety of ways. I encourage contact through messaging, texting, email, and phone calls. I meet students where they're at, and I build on their strengths. I communicate using synchronous and asynchronous means. I have fireside chats, and I remain open to learning about new methods and needs of students. I remind the students all the time, this is your classroom, and your attendance pays my salary. You tell me what you need to succeed. I reduce the focus on the attendance policy. I give second chances. I allow rewrites. I provide opportunities for oral components to our exams. I tell stories to put learning into context for our students so that it will help anchor theoretical concepts into their lived experiences. A short story I'd like to share with you involves a student that was having difficulty passing her math class in our program. After several attempts at the class, she landed in my class. I asked the student, what do you need to pass this course? And they said they needed daily support to work through problems and to understand the material. So that student and I met every day at 4 p.m. for 8 months, and we practiced math. The student passed the course at the end of those 8 months. The important lesson from this example is not that the student passed the course, which of course is significant. She earned her diploma. The more important lesson here is that connection matters. People matter. When we invest our time into our relationships with our students, everyone wins. Success is something hard won. It requires patience, practice, and commitment, and an investment of ourselves into the process. Thanks, Wanda, over to you.
Thanks, Tammy. I feel like clapping after that. I love that Tammy spoke. Thanks, Jim, for doing the clapping for us. I love that Tammy talked about focusing on building a relationship with students and creating community. I too believe this is truly foundational in creating a safe space in which students can learn. I believe that to create a more open, accessible, and emotionally safe environment and experience for students, we must challenge and flatten the power structure in which we work and they learn. Our college has a number of policies that I perceive to be paternalistic and colonial. I've chosen to challenge them, and I often do not follow these particular policies. For instance, there's a mandatory attendance policy that I think you've probably heard of from Jim and Tammy already. If students miss more than 10% of course time, they could be dismissed from the program and or the course. As we all know, adult learners are often juggling much more than just school. Students are welcome in the PSW program classroom, regardless of their performance or attendance. We really do not know what our students are struggling with, and to penalize them for missing class or poor performance can be deflating, particularly for people who have a negative or have had negative or traumatic educational experiences in the past. We need to think outside the box when it comes to student evaluation as well. We often measure success of a program or a course by the number of students who graduate or attrition rates. School is part of a journey for our students, and whether they graduate or not, we have helped them to change their lives in significant ways. People do not fail. They learn from every experience that they have in school. A student in our program a number of years ago came from a very small community where she was caring for aging parents and raising a pre-adolescent daughter. She's a smart gal who performed well when in the classroom, but she struggled with substance use. Early in the very first semester, she began coming to class smelling like alcohol and was sometimes visibly intoxicated. She had developed positive relationships with her classmates, and they cared about her well-being, as did I. She was permitted to stay in the classroom as long as she was not disruptive. Her academic performance became poorer as her substance use became more profound. On days when she was disruptive, I took her aside and quietly asked her to go home and have a rest. We took a compassionate approach and talked to her privately about supports and treatment programs, even offering to walk with her to the treatment center where she could get help. While we tried to be discreet about allowing her to stay on campus, I received a tremendous amount of pressure to follow college policy. Had I followed policy, she would have been on academic probation, receiving numerous letters telling her that she was failing and going to be dismissed from the program. I often wonder what this would have been like for her. She was already distressed and struggling. Why would I further compound that for her? Instead, we provided her with a safe, non-judgmental space where she felt welcome. This woman did not finish school, but she went for treatment for her substance use, and she's remained sober for the past 3 years. She did not graduate, but she's a success story in my eyes. She is sober, lives in her community, cares for her daughter and parents, and has a good job. She keeps in touch with me, and she believes her experience in school might have saved her life. Further to this, she talks about coming back and completing the program when her daughter finishes high school. I'm confident that I will see her back at school again someday. We left the door open for her instead of slamming it in her face. The challenge of childcare has also been difficult for students who do not have an informal support network in Yellowknife. To help students overcome this challenge, we have encouraged them to create childcare cooperatives with students in other programs or individuals living in the apartment building that acts as both student housing and affordable housing for seniors and people with low income. One student who was a single parent from a community approximately 1,000 kilometers away came up with a creative way to overcome her childcare challenge. She required childcare for her school-age children between 7 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. when her kids would start school for the day. She befriended an elderly neighbor who lived on the same floor in her apartment building. The elderly neighbor provided before-school childcare, and in turn, the student cooked supper for the neighbor several nights a week and invited her into her home for meals with her family. They became one another's extended family, decreasing feelings of loneliness and isolation that they might otherwise have been experiencing. This transpired into a mutually beneficial relationship. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Wanda. Yeah, I'll speak first about some of the institutional things that are happening to help learners overcome these barriers. So all of the courses in our community learning centers are offered without tuition, without textbook charges, and without user fees. Classroom space in the community where I live, however, limits us to about 10 participants in a course that's more than just a day or two. About 6 years ago, the college began switching from general upgrading courses to shorter literacy and essential skills courses centered around particular fields of employment. The previous English and math upgrading models were a poor fit for people that came to our particular community learning center. We would have 2 to 5 students who, for many different reasons, never progressed to the exit exams to level up to the academic standards required for on-campus courses. So Aurora College and the Northwest Territories Literacy Council created these shorter job readiness LES courses, and Indigenous government agencies administer the funds for a training allowance. So those two factors have really been very successful in terms of increased enrollments, still not more than 10 in a course, but we run in non-COVID conditions, up to 3 courses each semester. So there's a lot of opportunity for others to, people to fit into it. And our completion rates have really been good. But eliminating our continuous intake and open attendance has impacted the ability of individuals with certain disabilities to participate. Now, I still have people stopping me on the street asking, when can we come to school? And I have to explain that they now have to apply in advance for specific courses. So one thing we started doing is to reserve space in each course for learners living with educational challenges. And it's been gratifying to see that our funding partners have bought into this practice, and they're providing training allowances for these individuals that might otherwise have been passed over. It has occasionally raised challenges for the merit-oriented learners in the program. They complain, what are they doing here? And then that's an opportunity to have those conversations about open education, equity, inclusion. The design of our literacy and essential skills courses lend themselves to a pedagogy that values the life experience of learners and validates their stories as part of the course content. Well, they do include English and writing exercises, but I try to emphasize communicating learners' stories as more important than the grammar. And I encourage those who can use their Indigenous language in class to do so, even though I or a few younger students might not understand everything. I recently asked 2 ladies to speak to each other in their language in one of our early childhood education topics. And I was surprised when they began humorously exchanging insults and challenges in a way that just totally engaged the attention of everyone, including one young lady who understood very little of what was said. So I mentioned the elder in our Northern Perspectives course, her willingness to share her stories in both languages. It was a thing that opened the way for younger learners to offer their own experiences as a way to understand or even to critique the course content. So those are some of the ways we're currently trying to overcome barriers and open up the educational spaces.
Thank you, Jim. We'll move on then to our 4th and final question for this panel. How do you envision open learning in your context, and how do you see it helping students overcome barriers? Tammy?
Thanks, Wanda. So open learning requires equitable approaches to create that openness. First, we need to stabilize our internet connections across the territories. All students must have access to stable, fast, and affordable internet. Bandwidth issues need to be eliminated. Standards need to be set. Lower costs for internet needs need to be negotiated so that limits to the internet are not cost prohibitive or inaccessible. Once these criteria are met, we will then have a standard that is fair and equitable in the North, that is comparable to Southern standards and access. Currently, only 24% of Aboriginal communities nationally have access to comparable standards of Southern Canada. Given that there are 33 communities in the Northwest Territories and that 30 of these 33 communities are predominantly Aboriginal, it's evident that openness and access are challenged by these inequitable standards today. Once students have these basic needs fulfilled, we can talk about equity amongst our students. Equity isn't just about being able to gain equal access to our courses and programs. Equity to courses and programs is just the beginning. We can provide adult education so students can meet entrance requirements. We can accept students with prior learning assessments, but equity also needs to extend to enable equity of knowledge, knowledge systems, ways of knowing, and experiences. We need to go beyond neoliberal agendas and not dominant ways of teaching and learning. We need to expand practice to include non-traditional ways of learning and divergent pedagogies. Only then will learning be open and equitable for all. Thank you, Wanda.
Thanks, Tammy. Open learning in my context, it means so many different things to me, many of which I actually touched on in question 3. However, I've also learned a ton the last 2 days attending some of the sessions in the Open Education Conference. And I'm pretty sure by the end of this week, my answer might be a whole lot different than it is today. The foundation of my vision is this: provide a welcoming, accepting space with an emotionally safe atmosphere in which students can feel empowered and grow to their full potential. When the pandemic struck this spring and our campuses and our community learning centers closed for face-to-face delivery, the PSW program had just begun a pilot of distance education. Due to ongoing closures, we've established emergency distance learning for this academic year. When putting together a schedule for program delivery, we purposely clustered our face-to-face lab and practicum courses into a 3-month period of time toward the end of the academic year. And then we encourage students to remain in their home communities until March, when they will come to Yellowknife to complete these practical elements of the program. By offering flexibility in course and program delivery through distance learning, education will be more accessible for adult learners in the North. In addition, these students, those students who remained in their communities and are learning by distance are closer to their families and their social support networks. They will not experience the same housing and childcare issues they might have experienced if they had to remain in Yellowknife for the full 10 months of the program. In future, I envision offering lab and practical options in regional centers, taking education to the students rather than expecting them to come to us. So students don't need to travel to Yellowknife at all if they choose to remain at home. It's really a win-win for them and their communities because graduates can seek employment as support workers in their home communities, which in turn allows elders to age in place in their own homes. Elders would not have to leave their communities to receive support and services that they require either. I appreciate too that Tammy and Jim have spoken of the cost of internet services and the inequities that Northern students face. Until high-speed internet with a substantial bandwidth is affordable and equitable in the Northwest Territories, we are limited in distance learning offerings, but we are collectively working hard to overcome them. Jim, I'm going to ask you please to answer this final question about helping students overcome barriers.
Sure, Wanda. So I envision more courses designed with a practical focus, and this is for our learning centers. So the courses that will allow us to waive academic prerequisites for applicants, because this will remove barriers imposed by a colonial educational system. Our literacy and essential skills courses are examples of an instructional design that incorporates academic skill building into practical courses. I envision resolving and probably continually resolving the tension between short-term job readiness objectives and the need for longer-term mitigation of personal trauma in our educational spaces. I envision designing more free online courses, even after COVID, that don't depend on extensive synchronous teaching sessions. And that may address something that I saw Shannon posted in the chat. A flexible online course carries its own challenges, but it addresses the attendance barriers, especially if we can use the low stakes courses to teach learners how to take online courses and help prepare them for success in tuition-based courses that are more challenging and require greater commitment. I envision supported asynchronous online courses as a creative way to meet requests from employed learners for evening classes. Evening classes are a challenge in our single staff learning centers because of our collective agreements. We're just starting, just this week, the online pilot of our LES course, Introduction to Office Skills. So going online also allows us to lower the geographic and capacity limitations. We have 2 co-instructors, myself and another gentleman, and we were able to accept all 21 applicants from 7 different communities. I envision caring pedagogies that teach students how to leverage digital tools to take control of their own learning pathways. This power shift away from having to wait for space in a physical classroom is sorely needed. And here, I acknowledge that I take a more optimistic view of technology than Audrey Waters, but I deliberately started my statement with caring pedagogy instead of digital tools. I firmly believe that starting with caring relationships, and acknowledge what Tammy and Wanda have already said about that, starting with caring relationships based on trust is the way to mitigate the harms of technology against which Audrey warns us in her writing and webinars. I also believe that prioritizing care over content will help awaken the hope and curiosity in place of the anxiety and dread caused by overly controlling models of pedagogy. Again, what Audrey Waters would call cop shit. I envision internet access being recognized and funded as an essential service. We need public funding to remove the cost barriers that currently exacerbate the digital divide. And that divide does not exist along knowledge lines as much as it exists between those in poverty and those with power and privilege. We do have some private funders, but as I mentioned earlier, it's beset by mistrust and say stinginess. And I can't exclude myself from that somewhat pejorative portrayal. I bought 3, but only 3 entry-level smartphones with prepaid data plans to lend to online students in my community. That's about as much as I was willing to pay, even though I could assuredly afford more. So public funding of unlimited internet access is the only solution I can envision to truly open this avenue for education. Finally, I envision practices like open enrollment, open door attendance, open expression, valuing and validating learner language and voice over colonial grammar and form. I envision these things becoming standard practices.
Thank you, Jim. And I just have to tell everyone that the internet access is a real challenge, as I had to transition home to present from home as I had an unstable internet connection at work today. And Jim last night lost internet and power for a number of hours. So we're really grateful to have made it through the entire panel without losing our internet or our power. That's a pretty big deal for us in the Northwest Territories. I want to just thank everyone for coming. We're really humbled that you chose to attend our panel today. I realize there were some amazing sessions to choose from, so we're really grateful that you came and spent some time with us. We really have, I think, a lot of heart in the northern Canada, and I believe we have about 10 minutes for questions if you should wish to ask. I'm just going to go out of screen sharing mode.
Yeah, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, this is Jess.
Mitchell from I'm from where am I? I'm in Southern Ontario. I'm in Hamilton. I'm a little bit speechless. You three are amazing, and I think that this work that you're doing is fantastic. I hope your head is growing. You're how do you so how do you encourage people who aren't in such challenging contexts to have this kind of perspective on education, the compassion, the rethinking of what success is, the understanding students in their lives and their cultures and their context? How do we get that? Not just in Yellow, I mean, now I'm moving to Yellowknife, but how do we get that? How do we get that out elsewhere? I don't know if you have any ideas. Well,
I
no,
think
Jim,
Tammy's
I
the
mean,
one who really has done a lot of leading in this. I came in and started saying, "Oh, this is what I've learned from these, from my online community." And Tammy says, "Finally, somebody's getting it." So I don't know, Tammy, do you want to speak to how you developed?
I would love to. I've been singing this tune for 25 years, and I have to tell you that it took 18 before anybody listened to me. So my first comment is, I think it begins with one person, and I think you find like-minded people who feel the same way you do, and you keep pushing on that wall. I truly believe it doesn't matter where you live. We all come from a place of compassion, and all you need to do is have had one negative experience in your education to want to turn that around and make it something special for someone else. So I think shooting from the heart and pushing those boundaries, changing things that you know intuitively don't feel right, and being compassionate. Wanda, Jim?
Well, I was just laughing to myself as you're saying that, Tammy. Honestly, Jess, I haven't always been popular with my employer, to be honest. There were many times that I would go and knock on her office door and I'd say, you know, that I'm changing the world one student at a time, right? And that would always be how I would open a conversation when I would be challenging policy. When I would challenge policy and I would say, I know that I am supposed to do X, Y, and Z, but I'm telling you that I think we need to do XYZ instead. And so I would always go with a really good solution. And I would say, just give this a chance. Let's see how this plays out. Because I really feel like, I mean, students are our customers, but we're also there to be mentors and lead by example. And I think that you can't go wrong when you start with your heart and you build those relationships, and just keep advocating for students, keep them at the center of what we're doing.
I really have to credit the online community that was first introduced to by Stephen Downes, George Siemens, and Dave Cormier, and then Mahabali, entered that community a number of years ago when she was working on her PhD, and it has just really opened my eyes, not so much to the feeling of what should be done, but the vocabulary to express it, the way to implement it. And I also have to say, Tammy and Wanda are working on campus. In the community learning centers, we have maybe a lot more autonomy. I've had two supervisors in my 12 years with the college who have just been absolute jewels in advocating for the kind of things we need to do at the community learning centers. So I've not had the pushback that Wanda and Tammy might have felt. Had much more encouragement in these directions, and not just from the college, but people I work with outside of the college. So I may have had an easier ride in that. And now, I feel like with my role in our fledgling Center for Teaching and Learning, I'm maybe in a place where I can introduce more people to this concept. And, you know, as I talk with Wanda and Tammy, they say, oh, we know this one, or we know that one who we need to pull into this group. So yeah, growing it one person at a time. Thanks, Tammy, for that.
I'd like to kind of ask a follow-up question and first reflect on the outpouring of thank yous and agreements that I'm seeing in the chat. And for me, this has been a really meaningful session. So thank you again. And I remember a good friend of mine and coworker who's a graduate student who ended up suffering some trauma during graduate school. It really does, you know, in what would be perceived as a much more privileged position, it really doesn't matter where or, you know, where you are. Trauma is real and it happens to so many people. And kind of after that, I became more and more interested in research on trauma-informed education in college settings. And I have trouble finding it in college settings. There's a good bit in K-12, and I have trouble finding, I'm having trouble finding research on relationships. And I really appreciated how you all spoke to the importance of relationship and relational education. I'm curious both, is there research that you are reading on this, or are you just practicing and acting on the things you know? And if you could point me to anything in particular, a place to get started, I would deeply appreciate it. Thank you again.
Thanks, Peter, so much for those questions. I do have books, and it depends on if you're looking for biological stuff, or there's a book called Too Scared to Learn, and there's also another book. Maybe Wanda, maybe you remember the woman we had that worked with the hockey player. Do you remember her name? She did trauma.
Kim Bartel.
Thank you, Kim Bartel.
I'll just put it in the
so
chat.
we can put those in the chat spaces. But if you want to put your email or connect with me through my email, I can put it in the chat space. I'd be more than happy to give you a bunch of resources. It depends on it. Yeah.
That would be wonderful, and I'm definitely interested in both the biological and kind of the socio-technological. So thank you again.
My email in the chat right now.
I have to confess that most of the research reading I did was to justify some of my views in grad school. So I can't remember the particular authors. I did read a number of Indigenous scholars. So Brayboy would be one, Brian McKinley Jones Brayboy. Marie Batiste, there's some of the giants in that field. And there's a lot of others. They may not address the trauma exactly, but they are really strong on alternate ways of knowing.
Well, I hate to cut this conversation short. I'm going to stop the recording and sorry, I'm going to stop the recording if I can figure out how out there.